The rain had been falling on Fayetteville, North Carolina since midnight. A cold November rain that turned the roads to mirrors and kept the temperature locked at 34 degrees well past 6 in the morning. And Sergeant First Class Owen Briggs was in his patrol vehicle on base when his supervisor's voice came over the radio telling him to keep moving, that the woman sitting on the curb outside Gate 7 was a civilian matter, that she had been offered assistance, and that she had declined it. In the back of the vehicle, Kodak stood up. Then he pressed himself against the window on the passenger side, which he had not done in 4 years of service, except when something was wrong. 50 yards ahead, in the rain and the gray light, sat a woman in a thin coat on a concrete barrier at the edge of the base access road, a plastic bag at her feet, not moving. What Owen Briggs chose to do next, against a direct order on a November morning in North Carolina, would uncover a secret that had been growing inside one family for 2 years, while everyone close enough to see it looked the other way. If stories about people who do the right thing when it would be easier not to mean something to you, subscribe. This channel exists because those people deserve to be remembered. Owen Briggs had joined the Army at 18 because of a man named Patrick Briggs, his father, who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and who never once talked about what he had seen there, and who had the specific quality of a person who has been tested past comfort and emerged with a very clear understanding of what mattered. Owen had grown up watching his father the way children watch the adults they most want to become, not consciously, not with a plan, but with the particular attention that precedes imitation. By 17, he had decided. By 18, he was gone. He had served 16 years across 3 deployments, Iraq, then Afghanistan twice, and had come home the last time with both knees intact and a hearing loss in his left ear the VA had rated at 30%. In practical terms, it meant he always sat on the left side of a room so the people he was listening to were on his good side. He was 34, working military police on Fort Liberty, which he still sometimes called Fort Bragg out of habit, the way people keep the name a place has in memory. He did not talk much about what he carried. The carrying was the thing. The weight didn't go away when you described it. It just became someone else's problem, and the people he loved had enough of their own. He went to the gym at 5 in the morning. He called his father on Thursdays. He coached youth baseball in the spring, not because it made him better, but because it gave him 3 hours a week when his mind had no room for anything except the task in front of it. Kodak was a Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, fawn-coated with a black mask that made him look, from a distance, like he was wearing an expression of permanent mild disapproval. He had been Owen's patrol partner for 3 years, certified in apprehension and detection, and he operated in the field with the specific efficiency of a dog that had internalized the work so thoroughly that the commands were nearly superfluous. He read the situation, read Owen, and acted on both simultaneously. Off-duty, in Owen's apartment, he was a different kind of entity. Looser, unhurried, occasionally undignified in the way of a working dog that has understood, in its off hours, that dignity is optional. He stole socks. He had a particular fondness for lying with all 4 legs in the air for reasons that remained entirely his own. What he did not do, under any circumstances, was press himself against a window unless something required his attention. Owen had been called to Gate 7 at 06:15, a civilian non-compliance, a woman who had approached the gate on foot and refused to leave when asked. The duty sergeant had already contacted Fayetteville PD. They were 12 minutes out. Owen was to hold position and maintain visual until they arrived. That was the order. Kodak stood up and pressed against the glass. Owen pulled to the shoulder and sat for a moment. He had his orders. He had a reason to follow them. The woman had been offered assistance and had declined. She was not on the installation proper. She was on the access road, which was technically a gray zone, and the Fayetteville unit was 12 minutes out. He had 2 clear reasons to stay in the vehicle. Kodak did not take his nose off the glass. Owen got out of the vehicle. He left it running. He walked the 50 yards to the concrete barrier in the rain and stood in front of the woman and looked at her the way he had learned, over 16 years, to look at a situation before he formed a conclusion about it. She was old. Not vague old. Specifically old. The kind of old that comes with a face that has made every expression available to it so many times that the lines are permanent. She was wet. The thin coat was soaked through. She had white hair stuck flat to her forehead, and she was sitting very straight in the way of someone who had decided that posture was the last thing she was in control of, and she was not surrendering it. The plastic bag at her feet had a change of clothes in it, folded, not thrown in, folded, with the deliberate care of someone who had packed in a hurry, but had still found time to fold things. Because folding things was who they were. Owen said, "Ma'am." She looked up. Her eyes were gray and direct and had the quality of someone who had been waiting to be spoken to with a complete sentence. "I'm Sergeant Briggs," he said. "Can you tell me what's happening?" She said, "I'm waiting for my son." Owen said, "Is he on the installation?" She said, "He was." Owen registered the tense. "Can I call someone for you? Get you somewhere dry while we sort this out?" She said, with the particular patience of someone who has said a thing many times to people who have not heard it. "I don't want to go anywhere dry. I want to see my son. I've been trying to see my son for 11 days, and every time I come here, someone tells me he'll call me back, and he doesn't call me back." Kodak had come around the vehicle and was now sitting at Owen's left side, watching the woman with an attentiveness that had nothing of threat in it, just the full focus of an animal that has decided this person matters. The woman looked at Kodak. Something in her face shifted, not the softening of someone who likes dogs, but something older and less voluntary than that. "He looks like the dog my son had," she said. "Before," Owen said. "Before what?" She pressed her lips together. She looked at the plastic bag at her feet. Then she looked at Owen with the expression of a woman who has decided, after considerable deliberation, to trust one more time. "His wife," she said. "She told me he doesn't want to see me, but my son has never in his life not wanted to see me. And I've known him for 61 years, and I know the difference between a thing he's decided and a thing someone decided for him. 61 years. That meant a son born when she was." Owen did calculations. "How old are you, ma'am?" he said. 83, she said. "And before you ask, I took the bus. 3 hours from Raleigh. I took the bus because my daughter-in-law changed the locks and she has my car." Owen was still. Behind him, he could hear his radio. His supervisor's voice would come again in approximately 90 seconds. He looked at Kodak, who had not moved, whose eyes had not left the woman's face. Owen said, "My vehicle has heat, and I have questions that are going to take longer than the 12 minutes before the Fayetteville unit arrives." She picked up her bag. She stood up from the concrete barrier in the rain with the deliberate care of someone whose knees were not cooperating, but whose intention was absolute. "My name is Dorothy Alcott," she said, "and I would very much appreciate a dry place to tell you everything." Her full name was Dorothy May Alcott, and she was 83 years old, and she had been a nurse for 38 years, emergency room, Raleigh General, starting in 1968 when the hospital was still segregated in everything but paperwork, and ending in 2006 when her knees finally said what they had been saying for years. And she listened. She had the specific practical clarity of someone who has spent 4 decades making decisions in rooms where the wrong decision cost lives. A directness that some people found abrupt, and that the people who knew her well found like air after a long time indoors. She had raised 1 child alone after her husband, a man named Winston Alcott, died of a stroke in 1979 when their son, Marcus, was 4 years old. She had raised him on a nurse's salary in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the particular stubborn way of a woman who had decided what her child would become, and had simply proceeded toward that outcome without looking for permission. Marcus Alcott was 41. He had joined the Army at 20, served 12 years, come home to Raleigh, met a woman named Cheryl at a church function in 2016, married her in 2018, and been stationed at Fort Liberty in 2021 when his unit was reassigned. Dorothy had driven to see him every other month. She had a key to their house. She had spent holidays there. She had a specific chair in their living room that everyone called Dorothy's chair without anyone deciding to. Then, in January of this year, the calls had started spacing out. Then, Marcus had stopped answering. Then Cheryl had told her, in a phone call in March, that was the last direct conversation Dorothy had managed, that Marcus was struggling with some personal things and needed space, and that Dorothy calling every week was making it worse. Dorothy had given space. She had given 8 weeks of space. Then she had called, and the number had gone to a voicemail that was full. Then she had driven to Fayetteville and found the locks changed. Then she had tried to reach Marcus through the base and been told he was unavailable. Then she had tried his unit and been told he was in a non-contact status that was a standard designation for servicemen undergoing personal difficulty, which the Army had a protocol for, and which meant, in practical terms, that it was very difficult to reach someone unless you were the person who had put them in that status. Non-contact status required a request. The request had to come from the service member or from a dependent. Cheryl was a dependent. Dorothy was not. "I'm his mother," Dorothy said. "I'm all he has left. I'm all he has ever had." She said it without self-pity, as a statement of logistics. "And I know my son. I know the difference between Marcus choosing something and Marcus being managed. He doesn't. He has never in his life not called me back. Not when he was overseas. Not when there was nothing to say. He called me because I was the voice that meant home, and he knew that, and I knew that." She stopped. She looked at her hands in her lap. "Something is wrong with my son, and I cannot get to him." Owen had been listening with the stillness he used when he needed to hear not just the words, but the structure behind them, the logic, the timeline, the places where something had been left out versus the places where something had been withheld. Non-contact status was legitimate. It existed to protect service members in crisis from outside stressors. He had seen it used correctly. He had also seen it used incorrectly once, in a case that had gone through his unit 2 years ago, and that had ended badly because the non-contact designation had made it impossible for the right people to intervene until it was almost too late. The case had been reviewed afterward. There had been a policy discussion. The policy had not changed. He thought about a man named James Okafor, a corporal who had served under Owen's direct supervision for 14 months in Kandahar. A man who talked about his mother the way some people talk about gravity, like she was the constant, everything else oriented around. James, who had taken a roadside device outside Kandahar City in 2019, who had been medivist and survived and come home damaged in ways that were not all visible, who had sent Owen a Christmas card every year since then from an address in Fayetteville that Owen had never once driven to, because James was fine. James had said he was fine, and Owen had believed him because it was easier. He had not driven to that address. He still did not know if James Okafor had a Cheryl. Mrs. Alcott, Owen said, I'm going to need you to stay in this vehicle while I make some calls. And I need you to tell me everything you told me again, in order, with as many specific dates and details as you can give me. Dorothy looked at him. She looked at Kodak, who was in the back seat beside her, not touching, simply present, his amber eyes warm and steady in a way that had nothing to do with training. You believe me, she said. It was not a question. She was not accustomed to it coming this quickly. I believe you, Owen said. She straightened in the seat. She opened her mouth. She told him everything, in order, precisely, the way she had been trained to give a patient history, beginning with the last normal event and moving forward chronologically to the present, leaving nothing out. Have you ever known someone like Dorothy? A parent who did everything right, who showed up every time they were needed, and then one day found a locked door where a family used to be. If you're thinking of someone right now, type their name in the comments. Let this section be full of people who never stopped fighting to get back to the ones they loved. Owen made 3 calls from the vehicle, while Dorothy sat in the back with Kodak. The first was to his direct supervisor, a master sergeant named Brody, who told him in flat terms that the non-contact status was administrative and not within Owen's authority to circumvent, and that if he wanted to raise a concern about its application, he could do so through the proper channels, which took 3 to 5 business days. Owen acknowledged the guidance. He did not get out of the vehicle. The second call was to a woman named Captain Renata Shaw, the installation's family advocacy officer, who had her own office and her own authority, and who had, in Owen's experience, a particular impatience with procedural barriers that existed to protect an institution rather than a person. He described the situation in precise terms. An 83-year-old woman, bus from Raleigh, locked out of a house. Non-contact status applied to her son. No contact in 11 days. A car she could not get back. Captain Shaw was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, I'll need to open a welfare check under my authority. That supersedes the non-contact designation for purpose of an in-person wellness assessment. Give me 20 minutes. The third call was to the Fayetteville PD unit that was still inbound, now 8 minutes out, telling them the situation was being handled through base family advocacy, and they could stand down. While he waited for Captain Shaw's 20 minutes, Kodak pressed against the divider between the front and back seat and put his nose close to Dorothy's shoulder, without touching her, and Dorothy reached up without looking and put her hand on the side of his face and held it there, and the dog stayed very still and let her. Owen was in the front seat watching this in the rearview mirror when his radio came again. Master Sergeant Brody. Owen was to report to the duty office. He was to leave the civilian in the care of the arriving Fayetteville unit. Owen clicked the radio. He said, "Understood." He did not start the vehicle. 21 minutes later, Captain Shaw pulled up in her own vehicle. The welfare check brought them to a house on Meridian Street in Fayetteville, which was a civilian address where Cheryl Alcott had been living since March. Not the on-base housing, the civilian address, a rental, and which Owen had found by asking Captain Shaw's administrative coordinator a question that the coordinator technically did not have to answer, and answered anyway because she had been listening to Dorothy in the waiting area for 11 minutes. Marcus Alcott was in that house. He was alive. He was 41 years old, and he was sitting in a dim living room at 10 in the morning, and he was not well in ways that were not entirely visible, and Captain Shaw's expression, when she came back to the door, told Owen more than she was permitted to say out loud. Cheryl had opened the door. She had done it with the confidence of someone who believed that official presence was something she could manage, because she had been managing official presence for months. She was composed. She had an explanation for everything. She had documents ready, the non-contact request, the voluntary nature of it, Marcus's signature on the form. Owen looked at the signature. He had seen Marcus Alcott's service record, which Captain Shaw had pulled in the car. He had seen the signature on Marcus's re-enlistment form from 2019. The signatures were not the same. He said nothing, not yet. Kodak had been at Owen's left side since they came in. When Cheryl stepped back to gesture toward the living room, toward Marcus, toward the dim room where a man sat without looking up, Kodak stopped walking. His head came down. The sound that began in him was quiet and continuous and entirely certain, not alarm, decision. He positioned himself between Cheryl and the room where Marcus was sitting and did not move. Cheryl said, "Can you control your dog?" Owen said, "He's controlled." Captain Shaw said, to Cheryl, in the specific register of someone whose authority is about to become very formal, "Mrs. Alcott, I need to speak with your husband privately as part of a standard welfare assessment. That is not a request." Cheryl looked at Kodak. Kodak looked back at her without expression. She stepped aside. Dorothy had been in the hallway. She had not been told she could come in. Owen had not told her she couldn't. She walked into the living room and crossed it and sat down on the couch beside her son. And Marcus Alcott looked up at her face for the first time in 11 days. And what happened in that moment was not a thing that required anyone else in the room. Owen stood at the doorway. He looked at Cheryl, who was watching her husband and her mother-in-law on the couch, with an expression that was recalculating rapidly. He looked at Captain Shaw, who had her notepad out. He looked at the form on the end table, the non-contact request with the mismatched signature. Captain Shaw picked it up. She looked at it for a long moment. Cheryl said, "He asked me to fill it out. He wasn't in a condition to." Dorothy, from the couch, without raising her voice, said, "He called me." She took the phone. 5 words that were not 5 words. They were 11 days. They were a bus from Raleigh in the rain. They were a plastic bag with folded clothes on a concrete barrier at Gate 7. They were every call that had gone to a full voicemail and every locked door and every official who had said the right procedure was to wait. The room was still. Kodak did not move from the doorway. Owen said, in a voice that made no concession to volume or emphasis, the voice of a man who has been in rooms where things needed to be said clearly once, "Captain Shaw has authority over this welfare assessment. The non-contact form will be reviewed for authenticity. The vehicle registered to Dorothy Alcott, currently at this address, will need to be made available to its owner. Those 3 things are going to happen today." He looked at Cheryl. "What happens after that depends on decisions above my pay grade. But those 3 things are happening today." Cheryl's composure had the specific quality of something structural failing, not visible all at once, but present in the eyes before it reached anything else. She looked at the door. Kodak was in the doorway. She looked at the floor. The form on the end table, the one with the wrong signature, sat between them like the thing it was. Captain Shaw picked it up and put it in her folder. Her pen was already moving. Kodak watched Cheryl until she sat down. Then the growl, slow and quiet, stopped. He did not relax entirely. But his weight shifted back, fractionally, in the way of something that has made its point and is waiting on the humans to finish. What happened in the weeks following moved with the speed that family advocacy cases move when the officer has decided that speed is a professional obligation. The non-contact form was referred for forensic review. The vehicle was returned to Dorothy within 48 hours. A protective order was sought and granted. Marcus was connected to mental health services, not because he was broken, but because he had been in a place that made it very difficult to know which way out was, and he needed someone to stand at the door and tell him, It was open. Dorothy drove back to Raleigh on a Thursday with her car and her son in the passenger seat, the first time in 11 months. She played the radio. He looked out the window. They did not talk much, because they did not need to. They were people who had been each other's company for 41 years and had learned that presence was the thing. Owen filed his report. Master Sergeant Brody noted the deviation from procedure in his file. Owen acknowledged it. He did not apologize, because he had not done a thing that required one. And he had learned across 16 years the difference between the two. Captain Shaw submitted a separate commendation. It mentioned both Owen and Kodak by name. Owen came to Dorothy's house in Raleigh on a Saturday 6 weeks later, on an errand that had started as a welfare follow-up and become something less official. Dorothy made coffee and a particular kind of sweet potato biscuit that Marcus said she had been making his entire life and that Owen ate 3 of, while pretending that he was going to stop at 1. Marcus was quieter than Owen imagined he had been before, but present in a way that suggested the quietness was his own now, chosen rather than imposed. Kodak lay across the kitchen doorway and monitored everything with the amber-eyed attentiveness of a dog who had decided this house was worth watching. Dorothy said, at one point, while they were still at the table, "He knew." Owen looked up. "The dog," she said. "He knew before you did. He was already at the window before you turned the vehicle." Owen said, "He usually is." She looked at Kodak for a long moment, at the dog lying in the doorway with the easy authority of something that has done its work and knows it. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like an animal understanding something essential about a situation that all the rank and protocol and proper channels had not managed to see. "I prayed on that bus," Dorothy said. "I prayed for someone to stop." She picked up her coffee cup. "I didn't specify a Marine. But I should have known." What Owen Briggs did that morning was not the easiest available action. He had an order. He had a reason to follow it. He had a supervisor whose voice was already on the radio. He had Kodak pressed against the glass. He had long since learned which one to listen to. This story is for every parent who refused to stop showing up, and for every person who stayed, even when the easier thing was to keep moving. Is there a Dorothy in your life? A parent? A family member? Someone who has been locked out of a relationship they spent a lifetime building? Tell me about them in the comments. Let this section be full of people who never gave up. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here when the next one comes. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.